What does a person do when they have everything? For billionaire industrialist Alistair Rothman, the answer was simple: they take more. Dining at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, he saw a mere waitress, an insignificant girl to be mocked in his native German for his son's amusement. He assumed she was powerless, invisible. He was wrong. In a single chilling moment, his world of comfort and lies would be shattered. He didn't just mock a waitress. He awakened a ghost from his past, and she was about to expose a secret he had buried for 40 years. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about a truth that refused to die. The air in The Gilded Sparrow was a carefully curated symphony of wealth. It smelled of seared scallops, vintage Bordeaux, and the subtle, expensive perfumes of its patrons. Conversations were a low, confident hum, the sound of deals being made and fortunes being flaunted. Crystal glasses chimed like tiny perfect bells against the backdrop of a live jazz trio playing softly in the corner. For the people who dined here, this was not a special occasion. It was simply Tuesday. For Anneliese Schmidt, it was the battlefield. Each night, she donned the restaurant's severe yet elegant uniform, a black-on-black ensemble of a tailored vest, crisp shirt, and slacks that were comfortable enough for an 8-hour shift on her feet, but sharp enough to befit the establishment's 3 Michelin star reputation. She would tie her long honey blonde hair into a tight, severe bun, erasing any hint of individuality. Her face, which in another life might have been called striking, with its high cheekbones and intelligent, stormy gray eyes, became a mask of pleasant professional neutrality. She was a ghost in the machine of luxury, her purpose to be attentive, but invisible, anticipating needs before they were voiced. Her colleagues, a mix of aspiring actors, struggling artists, and career servers, saw her as an enigma. She was efficient, flawlessly so. Her knowledge of the menu, the wine list, and the intricate dance of fine dining service was impeccable. But she was quiet, intensely private. During breaks, while others traded gossip or complained about demanding customers, Anneliese would sit in a corner of the staff room reading. Not a novel or a magazine, but dense-looking textbooks on mechanical engineering and corporate law. Trying to get a degree on the side, Annie, a fellow waiter named David, had asked once, peering over her shoulder. Anneliese had simply smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. Something like that, just keeping the mind sharp. They didn't know that the name on her application, Anneliese Annie Bell, was a fiction. They didn't know that her tiny walk-up apartment in Queens was not just a home, but an operations center. Its walls covered not in posters, but in timelines, corporate family trees, and financial charts, all centered around one man, Alistair Rothman. Her life was a study in stark contrast. By night, she moved among the 1%, pouring them $500 bottles of Chateau Margaux. By day, she lived on instant noodles and cheap coffee, poring over documents her grandfather had left her. He was the reason she was here. Klaus Schmidt had been a brilliant engineer, a visionary, who saw the future in miniature components and frictionless gears. He had been a gentle, loving man who smelled of graphite and machine oil, and he had been Alistair Rothman's partner. Anneliese had been just a child when the end came. She remembered the shouting matches behind closed doors, her grandfather's face growing more gaunt and weary each day. She remembered the word betrayal being whispered by her grandmother. Then the collapse, the loss of their comfortable home, the mounting debts, the quiet shame that settled over their family like a permanent shroud. Alistair Rothman, her grandfather's charismatic and ruthless partner, had somehow wrestled control of their shared company, Schmidt-Rothman Innovations, and rebranded it as the global behemoth, Rothman Precision Engineering. Klaus Schmidt was written out of the story, his name erased, his contributions claimed by another. The official story was that Klaus had made a series of disastrous financial blunders, and Rothman had heroically saved the company from ruin. The stress and heartbreak consumed Klaus. He died a few years later, a broken man clutching a portfolio of patents that were now worthless, registered under a company name that no longer existed. He left Anneliese not a fortune, but a burden, a locked wooden box and a key. Inside that box, Anneliese, then a teenager, found his journals. Page after page of meticulous notes, schematics, and diary entries detailed Rothman's systematic fraud. He had created shell corporations, siphoned funds, forged signatures, and leveraged Klaus's trusting nature against him until he had nothing left. It was a slow, methodical corporate assassination. And there was something else in the journals, a constant reference to their shared heritage, their beginnings in Germany. They often spoke German when they wanted to discuss complex ideas without their American employees understanding. It was their private language. From that day forward, Anneliese had a singular, all-consuming purpose. She would not let Alistair Rothman enjoy his stolen legacy. She would reclaim her grandfather's name. She excelled in school, her mind a sharp tool inherited from Klaus. She won scholarships, worked 3 jobs, and put herself through college majoring in business. But a degree wasn't enough. A lawsuit would be a gnat against an elephant crushed by Rothman's army of lawyers. No, she needed to get close. She needed to understand the man to find a weakness. She learned that Rothman, a creature of habit, dined at the Gilded Sparrow at least once a month. It was his cathedral of success. And so Anneliese Schmidt died, and Annie Bell, the quiet, efficient waitress, was born. She spent a year working her way up from a lesser establishment, building a flawless resume until she landed the job. For 6 months, she had served tables, watched, and waited. She studied his routine, the way he dismissed the staff, the way he commanded a room. She perfected her German, listening to tapes for hours every night until the accent was flawless, the grammar innate. She was a predator, learning its prey, and tonight she had a feeling was the night the hunt would begin. The reservation was under his name for 8:00 p.m. Table 12, his favorite, a secluded booth with a commanding view of the restaurant. As she checked her station, ensuring every fork was perfectly aligned, Anneliese felt a cold calm settle over her. The ghost was ready to speak. The heavy glass doors of the Gilded Sparrow opened, and a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside seemed to enter with him. Alistair Rothman was not a physically imposing man. He was in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored Xenia suit that probably cost more than Anneliese's annual rent. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his face a mask of patrician arrogance, honed by decades of unquestioned authority. But it was his eyes that held his power, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept the room with an air of ownership, as if he were inspecting his personal property. Beside him was his son, Frederick Rothman. Taller than his father in his late 30s, Frederick wore his inherited wealth like an ill-fitting coat. He had the same sharp suit, the same expensive watch, a Patek Philippe, Anneliese noted, but he lacked his father's predatory stillness. There was a weakness in his eyes, a desire for approval that he constantly sought from the formidable man at his side. Mr. Chen, the restaurant's unflappable manager, greeted them personally. "Mr. Rothman, a pleasure to have you with us again. Your table is ready." "Of course it is, Chen," Alistair said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't thank him, he stated a fact. Mr. Chen, ever the professional, simply smiled and gestured. "Your server this evening will be Anneliese. She is one of our best." Alistair's gaze flickered over Anneliese for a fraction of a second. It was the look one gives to a piece of furniture, a brief dismissive acknowledgement of its existence and function. He saw a uniform, a servant, nothing more. Anneliese met his gaze with her practiced mask of pleasant neutrality, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "He doesn't see me. He doesn't see a thing." "Right this way, gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth and even. She led them to table 12. Frederick pulled out the chair for his father, a gesture of subservience. Anneliese stood patiently, hands clasped behind her back. "May I bring you something to drink while you look at the menu? Perhaps a bottle of the 09 Screaming Eagle," she suggested, knowing it was his usual choice. Alistair waved a dismissive hand. "Just sparkling water for now, with lemon, no ice, and don't hover." "Of course, sir," Anneliese replied, retreating with a small, respectful bow of her head. She fetched the water, her movements fluid and economical. As she placed the glasses on the table and poured, she could hear them begin to speak. And as she had predicted, as her grandfather's journals had suggested, he would Alistair switch to German. It was a way of creating a private bubble in a public space, of reinforcing their exclusivity. "Look at these people, Frederick." Alistair began, his voice laced with contempt. "They spend a fortune to sit in this room to feel important for one night. It's all a performance." "It is a fine restaurant, father," Frederick replied, his German less confident, more textbook. It's a stage, Alistair corrected him, and we are the only real ones in the audience. The rest are merely actors, including the staff. He gestured vaguely in Annalise's direction as she set down a basket of freshly baked bread. Look at her, probably a failed artist or something, empty in the eyes. Annalise's grip tightened on the silver tongs in her hand, the metal biting into her palm. She focused on placing a brioche roll on Frederick's side plate, her expression unchanged, empty in the eyes. If only you knew what was behind them, you old monster. She's just a waitress, father, Frederick murmured, sounding slightly uncomfortable. Exactly. Alistair scoffed. That's my point. They are background characters in our lives. Tools. You must remember that, Frederick. Never see them as people. It softens you. It makes you weak. Your grandfather, my old partner, he was weak. He saw people everywhere. He saw friends and colleagues. I saw assets and liabilities. That is why our name is on the tallest building in Frankfurt, and his is on a forgotten gravestone. The blood drained from Annalise's face. It was one thing to read about his cruelty in a journal. It was another to hear it spoken so casually, so venomously, just feet away from her. The mention of her grandfather's grave, spoken with such dismissive pride, felt like a physical blow. A hot white rage surged through her, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. She wanted to scream, to throw the water pitcher in his smug face, to tell him everything right there and then. But she didn't. That was not the plan. The plan was a blade, not a cudgel. It required precision. She breathed in slowly, steadying herself. She was a ghost. Ghosts don't feel anger. They wait. She retreated to a discreet distance, watching them. They discussed business, a hostile takeover of a smaller tech firm. Alistair was brutal in his assessment, dissecting the target company's weaknesses with the precision of a surgeon. When it was time to take their order, Annalise approached the table again. "Are you ready to order, gentlemen?" she asked in her placid, professional English. Alistair didn't even look at her. He was studying the menu, a small, cruel smile on his lips. He turned to Frederick, still speaking in German. "I think I'll have the lamb, but tell her to make sure the chef doesn't ruin it like last time. This staff is so incompetent these days." Then he made the mistake that would unravel everything. He looked directly at Annalise, a glint of malicious amusement in his eyes. He wanted to see her confusion, to enjoy this small act of power over the hired help. He spoke to her slowly and condescendingly, as if addressing a simple child. "The lamb, medium rare. Understood, girl." The word girl was the final spark, dismissive, infantilizing, and filled with contempt. Annalise stood perfectly still for a beat. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. This was the moment, the culmination of years of pain planning and silent rage. She let the mask of the deferential waitress fall away, and for the first time that night, she let him see the storm in her gray eyes. She did not reply in English. Instead, in flawless, crisp, accent-free High German, her voice as cold and sharp as breaking ice, she responded. "Certainly, Mr. Rothman," she began. "I will personally ensure your lamb is cooked to a perfect medium rare. Not too bloody like the contracts you had my grandfather sign, and not overdone like the balance sheets you falsified." Silence. A fork slipped from Frederick's nerveless fingers and clattered onto his plate, the sound echoing in the sudden void. His face went bone white, his jaw slack with disbelief. Alistair Rothman froze. The smug, arrogant expression on his face dissolved, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. His cold eyes, which had looked through her just moments before, were now locked on hers, widening in dawning horror. It was as if she had physically struck him. He was looking at a ghost. He was looking at Klaus Schmidt's granddaughter, and she was speaking the language of his darkest secrets. Annalise held his gaze, her posture unwavering. She added one final devastating sentence, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of an anvil. "And as for my grandfather, his name was Klaus Schmidt. I thought you should remember it, since you seem to have forgotten it on his tombstone." With that, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, turned on her heel, and walked towards the kitchen, leaving the two men sitting in a pool of stunned, horrified silence at the most exclusive table in New York. The hunt was over. The war had just begun. The walk from table 12 to the swinging doors of the kitchen felt like a mile. Annalise's legs were trembling, but she forced them into a steady, measured stride. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She had done it. She had thrown the grenade. Now she had to weather the blast. She pushed through the doors into the chaotic, humid ballet of the kitchen. The cacophony of clattering pans shouting chefs and the hiss of the grill was a welcome shield. She leaned against a cool stainless steel counter, closing her eyes for a second, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge. The face of Alistair Rothman, the shock, the dawning recognition, the flicker of pure fear was seared into her mind. It was a more satisfying image than she had ever dared to imagine. She took a deep breath, composed herself, and walked to the head chef, Jean-Pierre. Chef, 1 lamb, medium rare for table 12. The guest is particular. Jean-Pierre, a volatile genius with a fearsome temper, just grunted his acknowledgement. Annalise didn't wait. She walked straight to the small, cramped office of the manager, Mr. Chen. She knocked once and entered. Mr. Chen, a meticulously dressed man in his 50s, with kind eyes and an eternally calm demeanor, looked up from his paperwork. He had built the Gilded Sparrow's reputation on flawless service and discretion. He could spot trouble from 100 paces. "Annalise, is there a problem at table 12? He asked, his tone even. "There is about to be," she said, her voice shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb. "Mr. Rothman will be demanding that I am fired. Immediately." Mr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "And why would he do that? You are my most capable server." Annalise took another breath. She owed this man who had shown her nothing but professional respect, at least a partial truth. "He and his son were speaking about me in German. They were disrespectful, and they mentioned a personal family matter. So I responded, in German." Mr. Chen's expression didn't change, but a new light of understanding flickered in his eyes. He had seen the arrogance of men like Rothman 1,000 times. "I see. And this family matter. The man he was insulting, the weak partner he cheated to build his company, was my grandfather." The manager leaned back in his chair, his calm exterior finally cracking just a little. He looked at Annalise, truly looked at her, and saw past the waitress uniform for the first time. He saw the intelligence, the pain, and the iron will she kept so carefully hidden. "So your name is not Annie Bell. It's Annalise Schmidt." Before Mr. Chen could respond, the office door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Alistair Rothman stood there, his face a mask of thunderous rage. His composure was gone, replaced by the raw fury of a king whose authority had been challenged by a peasant. Frederick hovered behind him, looking terrified. "Chen!" Rothman bellowed, his voice echoing in the small office. "I want this insolent little witch fired. Now I want her thrown out of here and blacklisted from every restaurant in this city." Mr. Chen rose slowly from his chair, placing himself between Rothman and Annalise. His small frame seemed to gain stature, his demeanor shifting from manager to protector. "Mr. Rothman," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I would ask you to lower your voice. This is my establishment." "Your establishment?" Rothman laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I could buy this place with my pocket change and turn it into a parking garage. You will do as I say. Fire her." He pointed a trembling finger at Annalise. "She insulted me and my son. As I understand it," Mr. Chen said, his eyes like chips of flint, "the insults began at your table, in a language you assumed my staff would not understand. You were mistaken. Annalise is fluent in German, among other things." The fact that Chen knew her name, that he was defending her, seemed to enrage Rothman even more. "Her name is Bell, Annie Bell. It's on her tag," he spat. "Her name," Mr. Chen corrected him smoothly, "is Annalise Schmidt, and she will not be fired." Rothman stared, momentarily speechless. He was not used to being denied. He was not used to anyone, let alone a restaurant manager, standing up to him. He refocused his fury on Annalise. "You!" he seethed, taking a step forward. "You think this is clever, a little stunt? You have no idea who you are dealing with. I will ruin you. You will never work again. You will be buried under so much legal trouble, you will wish you were on that gravestone with your pathetic grandfather." The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Frederick flinched, looking away. He had the decency to seem ashamed. Annalise, however, did not flinch. She stepped out from behind Mr. Chen, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. My grandfather was not pathetic, she said, her voice clear and steady. He was a genius and an honest man. Two things you wouldn't understand. And you can't threaten me, Mr. Rothman. You can't take anything from me because you and your greed already took it all once before. There's nothing left for you to burn. She held up her phone. And for the record, this conversation is being recorded, as was your charming dinner chat. My lawyer will find your threats of being buried most interesting. Rothman's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of pure hatred. The mention of a lawyer changed the calculus. This was no longer just an emotional outburst. It was a tactical battle. He had underestimated her. Grossly. He took a step back, his rage receding into a more dangerous, calculating coldness. He smoothed down his suit jacket, a pathetic attempt to regain his composure. This is not over, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. This is so far from over. He turned and stormed out of the office, Frederick scurrying after him like a frightened puppy. The sound of them leaving the restaurant, of the heavy glass doors swinging shut, was definitive. A line had been crossed. Annalise finally let out the breath she'd been holding, her body slumping with the release of tension. She leaned against the desk, her hands shaking. Mr. Chen walked over to a small cabinet and poured a glass of water. He handed it to her. Drink, he said gently. I believe your shift is over for the night. She took the glass with a grateful nod. Mr. Chen? Thank you. You didn't have to do that. He could ruin you. Men like Rothman believe their money makes them gods. Mr. Chen said, his gaze distant. They forget that the rest of us are still human. My father was a tailor in Hong Kong. A very good one. A rich man stole his designs and put him out of business. He died with nothing but his pride. I will not stand by and watch the same story play out in my restaurant. He looked at her with newfound respect. You have a fight on your hands, Annalise Schmidt, a big one, but you are not alone. Annalise nodded, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a declared enemy of one of the most powerful men in the world, and as she looked at the kind, determined face of her manager, she realized he was right. She wasn't entirely alone. The first crack in Alistair Rothman's empire had appeared. Now it was time to shatter it. The morning after the confrontation at the Gilded Sparrow, the world felt different. The air was charged, humming with the invisible energy of a brewing storm. Annalise sat in her small queen's apartment, the relative silence a stark contrast to the turmoil of the previous night. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a thrumming, anxious dread. She had kicked the hornet's nest. Now the swarm was coming. Her phone rang precisely at 9:00 a.m. It was an unknown number, but she knew who it was. She let it ring 4 times before answering, her voice calm and collected. This is Annalise Schmidt. The voice on the other end was smooth, cold, and oozed expensive legal education. Ms. Schmidt, my name is Arthur Vance. I am senior counsel for Rothman Precision Engineering. I am calling regarding an incident that occurred last night. My client, Mr. Alistair Rothman, is prepared to be generous. Annalise almost laughed. Generous. Of course. First the threats, then the money. The classic 1-2 punch of the powerful. I'm listening, she said, pulling a notepad closer. Mr. Rothman is willing to overlook your unprofessional conduct and the slanderous accusations you made. Vance continued, his voice dripping with condescension. In exchange for your silence and the signing of a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, he is prepared to offer you a one-time payment of $50,000. $50,000. To a waitress, it should have been a life-changing sum. To Alistair Rothman, it was less than the cost of the wine he'd ordered last night. It was an insult wrapped in a bribe. Mr. Vance, Annalise said, her voice turning to ice. Let me be very clear. My grandfather's legacy, his name, his life's work, that is not for sale. Not for $50,000, not for $50 million. You can tell Mr. Rothman his offer is rejected. There was a pause on the other end. Vance was likely unused to such a swift, unequivocal refusal. Ms. Schmidt, I urge you to reconsider. You are in a precarious position. You have no proof of your wild claims. We, on the other hand, have a team of the best litigators in the country. We can make your life exceptionally difficult. Is that another threat, Mr. Vance? Annalise asked sweetly. Because I'm still recording. My lawyer loves these little gems. This conversation is over. Vance snapped and the line went dead. Annalise hung up and immediately dialed another number. Benjamin Carter, attorney at law. A warm, steady voice answered. Ben, it's me. The first shot has been fired. Benjamin Carter was the antithesis of Arthur Vance. He was a small-time lawyer who operated out of a cramped office in Brooklyn, specializing in fighting for the underdog. He had been a friend of her father's, and when Annalise had first approached him 2 years ago, with her grandfather's journals, he had taken the case pro bono, fueled by a righteous anger at the injustice. He was shrewd, tenacious, and utterly unimpressed by wealth or power. Annalise recounted the entire evening, from the German insults to Rothman's threats in the manager's office to the phone call from Vance. Ben whistled softly on the other end. 50 grand. He scared Annie. That's a go-away now offer? He knows you're not just some crackpot. He knows who you are. What's our next move? She asked. We move from defense to offense. Ben said, his voice now sharp and focused. He thinks you have nothing but a story. It's time to show him he's wrong. Do you still have it? Of course, Annalise said. She walked over to the false bottom of her closet, pulling it up to reveal a small fireproof safe. She spun the combination and opened it. Inside, nestled amongst her grandfather's journals, was a slim leather portfolio. Okay, Ben instructed. The game has changed. You can't stay at that apartment. Rothman is not above hiring private investigators to follow you to dig for dirt to intimidate you. I have a friend with a small garden apartment in the village. It's safe. I'm sending you the address. Pack a bag with essentials and the portfolio. Nothing else. Wipe your laptop. Leave your phone. I'll have a burner waiting for you. Meet me at my office in 2 hours. The urgency in his voice was sobering. This was real. This was dangerous. Annalise followed his instructions with methodical precision. As she packed the portfolio, she paused to look at its contents again. This was her ace in the hole, the truth that went beyond her identity. Her grandfather's journals had been filled with technical data and personal anguish, but one entry had been different. It spoke of a final desperate meeting with a man named Heinrich Weber, the company's chief financial officer at the time, a fellow German immigrant who had been with them from the start. Klaus had begged Heinrich to come forward to expose Alistair's fraud. Heinrich had refused, terrified of Rothman, but guilt had clearly eaten at him. A week after Klaus was forced out, Heinrich had quit, citing personal reasons, and disappeared. For years, Annalise had tried to track him down with no success. Then a breakthrough. A year ago, she'd found a death notice for a Heinrich Weber in a small, obscure newspaper from a town in rural Pennsylvania. On a hunch, she had driven there. She found his widow a frail but sharp woman named Greta. When Annalise told her who she was, Greta Weber had wept. Her husband, she explained, had lived his entire life tormented by his cowardice. He had never forgiven himself for abandoning Klaus Schmidt. Before he died, he had given Greta a key to a safe deposit box and a letter to be opened only if a descendant of Klaus Schmidt ever came looking for the truth. Inside that box was the bombshell. It wasn't just a confession, it was proof. Heinrich, a meticulous accountant, had secretly copied everything. There were the original, unaltered balance sheets showing the company's true profits. Alongside them were the falsified versions Rothman had used to claim insolvency. There were copies of bank statements from the offshore accounts Rothman had set up to siphon money. Most damning of all was a small, reel-to-reel audio tape. Heinrich, fearing for his safety, had secretly recorded his final conversation with Rothman, where Rothman explicitly detailed the fraud and threatened Heinrich into silence. And there was one more thing. A signed letter from Heinrich, notarized and dated, explaining every document, every transaction, every lie. It was a complete, undeniable roadmap of Alistair Rothman's grand theft. This was the truth Annalise held in her hands. It wasn't just her word against a billionaire's. It was a dead man's guilt, meticulously preserved. 2 hours later, she sat in Ben Carter's cluttered office. He was on the phone, his expression grim. "They're already moving," he said after hanging up. "A friend at the courthouse tipped me off. Rothman's lawyers just filed a motion for a preemptive restraining order against you for harassment. They're trying to paint you as an unstable stalker. They're trying to control the narrative," Annalise said, her voice steady. Exactly. Ben nodded, a predatory glint in his eye. But they don't know what we have. Arthur Vance thinks he's playing poker. He doesn't realize we're holding a royal flush. He picked up the portfolio and examined the contents, his respect for the late Heinrich Weber growing with every page he turned. "This is dynamite, Annie," he breathed. "Absolute dynamite. The tape is the kill shot." He looked up at her. "So here's the plan. We don't respond to their motion in court, not yet. We let them think they have us on the run. We're not going to sue him either. A lawsuit would take years and he'd bury us in appeals. We are going for a corporate kill." "What does that mean?" "Rothman Precision Engineering is a publicly traded company, but Alistair still holds a controlling interest in the chairmanship of the board." Ben explained, his energy infectious. "But even he has to answer to his board of directors. They care about one thing above all else: shareholder value. A public scandal of this magnitude, fraud at the very foundation of the company, it would crater the stock. It would open them up to massive shareholder lawsuits. The board will cut off a limb to save the body. Alistair is that limb." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "We request a private emergency meeting with the board. We present them with this. We give them a choice. Either they remove Alistair Rothman, restore Klaus Schmidt's name and founding partnership posthumously, and provide a substantial settlement to his only heir, you or we walk out of that room and straight to the New York Times and the SEC." It was bold. It was aggressive. It was perfect. "They won't just roll over," Annalise said, testing the plan. "No," Ben agreed. "But they are businessmen. They will look at the evidence, look at the cost of a fight, and look at the cost of a quiet settlement. They will choose the path of least damage. Alistair's pride will scream for a fight, but the board's pragmatism will cut his throat before he can start one." A fragile hope, more powerful than any anger, began to bloom in Annalise's chest. For the first time, she saw a clear path, not just to revenge, but to justice. A path that would restore her grandfather's name to its rightful place. The storm was no longer just brewing. It was about to break right over the gleaming glass tower of Rothman Precision Engineering, and they were holding the lightning. The next 48 hours were a blur of strategic silence. As Ben Carter predicted, Alistair Rothman's legal team went on the offensive. Stories began to leak to the gossip columns, carefully worded pieces about a disturbed and disgruntled ex-employee with a fantastical obsession with the famed industrialist. They painted Annalise as a fantasist, a woman seeking a payday by harassing a pillar of the business community. It was a classic smear campaign designed to discredit her before she could even speak. Annalise, hidden away in the quiet Greenwich Village apartment, watched it all unfold online with a strange sense of detachment. They were attacking a caricature, a fictional character named Annie Bell. They had no idea who they were really fighting. Ben Carter, meanwhile, was moving like a grandmaster, positioning his pieces for checkmate. He bypassed Arthur Vance and Rothman's legal pit bulls entirely. He drafted a single, chillingly formal letter. It was addressed not to Alistair, but to each member of the Rothman Precision Engineering Board of Directors, delivered to their private homes by courier. The letter was brief and terrifyingly vague. It stated that his client, Annalise Schmidt, the granddaughter of the company's co-founder, Klaus Schmidt, had come into possession of incontrovertible and legally verified evidence, detailing foundational fraud committed during the company's inception. It mentioned offshore accounts, falsified documents, and an audio recording. It concluded by formally requesting an emergency meeting with the board without the presence of Chairman Alistair Rothman to present this evidence. The final line was the masterstroke. "We believe a swift and private resolution is in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. Should you decline this meeting, we will be forced to pursue public and federal channels." The effect was instantaneous. It was like dropping a phosphorus grenade into a country club. These were men and women of immense wealth and reputation, board members of multiple corporations. They were risk-averse, their primary directive to protect the institution and their own standing. A public scandal involving foundational fraud was their worst nightmare. Within hours, Ben's phone was ringing off the hook. It wasn't Rothman's lawyers. It was the personal attorneys of the board members. The tone was no longer aggressive. It was cautious, probing, deeply concerned. A meeting was granted. 2 days later, in the main boardroom on the 50th floor of the Rothman Tower, Alistair Rothman was strongly advised by his fellow board members to not attend. The morning of the meeting, Annalise stood before a full-length mirror. She was no longer wearing a waitress's uniform. On Ben's advice, she had spent a small portion of her savings on a single impeccably tailored, dark gray suit, a crisp white silk blouse, and simple low heels. Her hair was not in a severe bun, but styled professionally, falling just past her shoulders. She looked for the first time in years like who she was, the heir to a brilliant legacy. The transformation was more than just clothes, it was armor. Ben met her in the lobby of the colossal glass and steel tower. "Ready?" he asked, his own expression grimly determined. "I was born ready for this day," she replied, her voice steady. The private elevator ride to the 50th floor was silent and swift. When the doors opened, they stepped into a hushed world of polished mahogany, original modern art, and panoramic views of Manhattan. A severe-looking woman led them to the boardroom. The room was intimidating. A massive dark wood table dominated the space, surrounded by 12 high-backed leather chairs. 10 of them were occupied by the board members, a collection of powerful, stern-faced men and women in their 50s and 60s. They looked at Annalise with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and anxiety. At the head of the table, one chair sat ominously empty. Alistair's chair. Annalise and Ben took their seats at the opposite end. The lead director, a man named Robert Caldwell, with a mane of white hair and a reputation for ruthless pragmatism, spoke first. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Schmidt, we are here. You have made some extraordinary claims. The floor is yours." Ben Carter stood up. He didn't grandstand. He didn't make emotional appeals. He simply opened his briefcase and, with the help of a technician, connected a laptop to the room's large display screen. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he began, his voice calm and factual, "what we are about to show you is a history of this company that has been deliberately buried for 40 years. For the next hour, they listened in stunned silence. Ben projected the documents from Heinrich Weber's portfolio onto the screen. He showed them the two sets of books side by side, the real ones showing a thriving, profitable young company, the fake ones showing mounting losses. He displayed the statements from the Bahamian bank account in the name of a shell corporation that traced directly back to Alistair Rothman. He walked them through Heinrich's signed, notarized confession, a roadmap that made the fraud impossible to deny. The expressions around the table shifted from skepticism to shock, then to cold, hard anger. They were not angry at Annalise. They were angry at being lied to, at the risk Alistair had exposed them all to for decades. But the final blow, the true coup de grace, was the tape. Ben placed a small digital audio player on the table. "This," he said, "is a recording of a conversation between Alistair Rothman and his then CFO Heinrich Weber, made 40 years ago." He pressed play. The scratchy, analog sound filled the silent room. Alistair's voice, younger, but unmistakably his, was sharp and cruel. "Klaus is a sentimental fool, Heinrich. He trusts me. He signs what I put in front of him. The losses are a fiction, and you know it. The money is safe." Heinrich's voice, trembling and laced with a thick German accent, replied, "Alistair, this is a crime. We will be ruined." "No," Alistair's voice answered, laced with menace. "You will be ruined if you speak a word of this to anyone. I will crush you. Klaus is already finished. He just doesn't know it yet. You have a family, Heinrich. Think of them. Your loyalty is to me now, not to that pathetic dreamer." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier and more profound than any sound. The proof was not just incontrovertible, it was visceral. They had heard the soul of the man who led their company stripped bare of its civilized facade. Robert Caldwell slowly took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at his fellow board members. He saw no dissent in their eyes, only grim resolve. He then looked at Annalise, and for the first time he saw her not as a threat, but as the victim of a colossal injustice. "Ms. Schmidt," Caldwell said, his voice heavy, "what is it that you want?" Annalise stood up, her hands resting on the back of her chair. Her voice when she spoke was not vindictive, but filled with a powerful, quiet dignity. "I want 3 things, she began. "First, the immediate and permanent removal of Alistair Rothman from the board and from any position associated with this company. Second, I want a full public retraction of the lies told about my grandfather, Klaus Schmidt. His name is to be restored as co-founder and the company's official history rewritten to reflect the truth. His portrait will hang next to Rothman's in the lobby. She paused, taking a breath. And third, she continued, my grandfather's share of this company, the half that was stolen from him, has been compounding in value for 40 years. My family was denied that legacy. I want it back. My lawyer has calculated a figure based on the company's growth and valuation. It is a substantial sum, but it is far less than what a public lawsuit and SEC fines would cost you. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It had a number on it with 9 zeros. Caldwell looked at the paper, then at Ben, then back at Annalise. He nodded slowly. Leave this with us. We need to confer privately. As Annalise and Ben stood to leave, the boardroom doors suddenly burst open. Alistair Rothman stood there, his face purple with rage. He had clearly been waiting, unable to bear the suspense. He was flanked by his lawyer, Arthur Vance, and his son, Frederick. What is the meaning of this? Alistair roared, his eyes blazing. You are meeting behind my back with this liar. Robert Caldwell stood up, his expression like granite. Alistair, this meeting is for board members only. You are no longer welcome here. I am the chairman of this company. I built it, he bellowed. No! Annalise said, her voice cutting through his rage. She turned to face him one last time. You didn't build it. You stole it. And we all heard you admit it. Alistair's eyes darted to the audio player on the table, and a flicker of genuine panic crossed his face. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of his board. He looked at the triumphant, steady gaze of Klaus Schmidt's granddaughter. And in that moment, he knew he was beaten. But his arrogance wouldn't let him retreat. You will hear from my lawyers, he spat. No, Alistair, Caldwell said, his voice final. You will hear from ours. We accept the terms. It was at that moment that the final unexpected twist occurred. Frederick Rothman, who had been standing silently behind his father, pale and shaken, took a small step forward. Father? He's right, Frederick whispered, his voice cracking. I listened to the tape they sent to my lawyer this morning. I heard what you did. All these years, all the stories you told me about Grandfather Schmidt, they were all lies. Alistair whirled on his son, his face a mask of betrayal. You are weak just like he was. Maybe, Frederick said, looking at Annalise with an expression of profound shame. But I won't be a part of it anymore. He turned to the board. I am resigning my position as vice president, effective immediately. That was the blow from which Alistair could not recover. The condemnation of his peers was one thing. The defection of his own son, his heir, was a complete repudiation of his entire life. He seemed to shrink, the rage draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated old man. He stared at Annalise, his mouth opening and closing, with no sound coming out. He had mocked her in German, called her Mädchen, dismissed her as a background character. Now she stood before him as the architect of his ruin, the ghost who had not only come back to haunt him, but had seized his kingdom. Without another word, Alistair Rothman turned and walked out of the boardroom, a titan reduced to a relic. His empire had not fallen to a corporate raider or a market crash, but to the quiet, unyielding resolve of a waitress he had made the mistake of insulting. 3 months later, the winter snow fell in thick, silent flakes over Central Park. Annalise watched from the large bay window of her new home, a tastefully restored brownstone on the Upper West Side. The apartment wasn't a palace, it was a sanctuary. The walls were lined with bookshelves instead of corporate charts, and the air smelled of fresh coffee and old paper, not instant noodles and simmering rage. The ghost had found a place to rest. The money, when it had been transferred, was an abstract and staggering figure. For a week, she had simply stared at the balance, feeling disconnected from it. It wasn't a prize. It was a restitution, a heavy responsibility. The true victory had come the day she walked into the lobby of what was now called Schmidt Vanguard Engineering, and saw her grandfather's portrait hanging in its rightful place. It was a painting from an old photograph showing Klaus in his 30s, his eyes bright with ideas, a slide rule peeking from his pocket. In that moment, the weight of her mission had lifted, replaced by the quiet, profound weight of his name, now restored and honored. She had spent the intervening months building the Klaus Schmidt Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing grants and mentorship to young, brilliant engineers and inventors who lacked financial backing. Her days were no longer spent on her feet serving the wealthy, but in meetings with patent lawyers and university deans, meticulously reviewing proposals for everything from new forms of renewable energy to revolutionary medical devices. She was not just managing wealth, she was cultivating the very kind of genius her grandfather had embodied. One crisp afternoon, while walking through the park, she saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench, hunched against the cold. It was Frederick Rothman. He looked thinner, and the expensive, ill-fitting coat of arrogance he once wore was gone, replaced by a simple wool jacket and an air of quiet contemplation. He saw her approaching and stood up, a flicker of apprehension on his face. "Ms. Schmidt, Annalise," he corrected himself, his voice hesitant. "Frederick," she replied, her tone neutral but not unkind. I wanted to say, I'm sorry." He said the words, seeming to cost him a great deal. "Not for my father. Nothing can excuse what he did. I'm sorry for my own part in it, for my silence, for my weakness." Annalise studied him for a moment. She saw no guile, only a man grappling with the ruins of his identity. "What are you doing now?" she asked. "I'm going back to school," he said with a small, self-deprecating smile. "For architecture. I want to build things, real things, with my own name on my own merits." He met her gaze. My father is living in Switzerland. He doesn't speak to me. He is a man utterly alone with his money. I think in the end, that's a worse prison than any court could have ordered." Annalise nodded slowly. The anger she once felt was a distant echo. There was nothing left to fight. "I wish you luck, Frederick," she said, and she meant it. As she walked away, leaving him to his new beginning, she felt the last vestiges of the past fall away. Her fight had never truly been about Alistair Rothman's downfall. It had been about Klaus Schmidt's ascent. It was about ensuring that his name would be remembered not for a forgotten gravestone, but for the new generation of innovators who would build the future their dreams funded by the legacy he had almost lost. The Waitress uniform was packed away in a box, a reminder not of servitude, but of the armor she wore to win a war. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic courtroom battle that brought Alistair Rothman down, but a quiet, calculated reckoning in the heart of his own empire. The story of the waitress who spoke German became a quiet legend among the elite of New York, a cautionary tale about the ghosts of the past and the danger of underestimating those you deem beneath you. Annalise Schmidt didn't just win a fortune, she reclaimed a name. The portrait of her grandfather, Klaus Schmidt, a kind-faced man with intelligent eyes, was hung in the lobby of the newly restructured company. The truth buried for 40 years was finally brought into the light. Annalise, with the resources to honor her family's legacy, established a foundation in her grandfather's name, funding brilliant young engineers who, like him, were more interested in innovation than in profit. She proved that the greatest power isn't wealth or status, but the unshakable strength of a truth whose time has come. If you were moved by Annalise's incredible fight for justice and the reclamation of her family's honor, please give this video a thumbs up. Her story is a powerful reminder that integrity and perseverance can triumph over the greatest of odds. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the past can never be truly erased and that one person's courage can change everything. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories of incredible twists of fate and inspiring triumphs. Thank you for listening.